The new year arrived not with hope, but with fire. January 1865. Snow and ash drifted down together over a land that had been at war for nearly 4 years. The United States, still called the Union in most circles, was bleeding, but standing. The Confederate States were burning, starving, dying, but not dead. Not yet. In Washington, President Abraham Lincoln was a tired man. He rarely slept more than a few hours, his cheeks hollowed by grief and pressure. But his eyes, those famously melancholy eyes, remained fixed on 2 goals: victory and abolition. He had come this far. Now, in this final stretch, he would not flinch. The war must end, and slavery must end with it. Far to the south, General William Tecumseh Sherman was not waiting. His march to the sea had become legend. Now, with Georgia behind him, he turned his attention to the Carolinas. His troops, hardened by years of blood and marching, moved like a machine. Where they passed, railroad tracks twisted into snarls. Cotton fields blazed like funeral pyres, and Confederate morale crumbled like old parchment. Sherman did not merely fight armies. He waged war on the very will to resist. Yet the Confederacy refused to collapse outright. General Robert E. Lee still held his battered lines around Petersburg, Virginia, just south of Richmond. Ulysses S. Grant, the Union's silent hammer, had laid siege for months. A slow, grinding death. Trench lines stretched for miles, where men shivered in the cold and died in the mud, sometimes in silence, sometimes in screams. Each week brought more skirmishes, more names to be written in ledgers and carved into headstones. The South was running out of everything: food, bullets, shoes, but not pride. Not yet. In Richmond, Jefferson Davis clung to the dream. The Confederate president issued proclamations of courage and righteousness, even as his government trembled on cracked marble. His generals were exhausted, his people gaunt. The streets buzzed with rumors. Could the war be ending? Would there be peace? But what kind of peace? In early January, word spread. Peace commissioners might be sent north. Perhaps a compromise could be reached. Perhaps some dared to hope. The Confederacy could survive in some form. A negotiated settlement, a return to sovereignty, maybe even slavery, preserved under a different name. But Lincoln had heard it all before. He knew what the word peace meant when it came from Richmond. It meant delay. It meant recognition. And it meant betrayal of the cause for which so many had died. There would be no compromise. Not now. Abolition was no longer a dream. It was policy. The 13th Amendment, passed by the Senate the previous year, still hung in the balance in the House. Lincoln made it his mission to see it through. He cajoled, persuaded, and pressured members of Congress behind closed doors. He saw the war not just as a conflict of armies, but of ideas, of morality itself. And he would not see the country re-stitched with chains still rattling in its foundations. Meanwhile, in the fields of South Carolina, Sherman's soldiers advanced. They moved like ghosts and gods, burning bridges, tearing up rail lines, living off the land. South Carolina, the very state that had fired the first shot at Fort Sumter, was now reaping what it had sown. Southern civilians fled in panic. Some took to the roads with all they could carry. Others stayed and prayed the Yankees would pass them by. They rarely did. Barns were torched. Livestock seized. Resistance met with fire. Sherman believed in total war. He wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake, but he understood something profound. This war would not truly end until the South's will to fight was broken. He had no time for Confederate pride or honor. Every town burned was a step closer to peace. Every plantation destroyed was one less resource for the rebel cause. He saw it not as vengeance, but surgery. Yet for all this destruction, death still came in greater numbers on the frozen front lines around Petersburg. There, Grant pushed and prodded, always careful, always deliberate. His troops endured harsh conditions, subsisting on hardtack and beans, plagued by disease and cold. Yet they pressed on. For them, the end was finally visible, faint like a lantern at the end of a long tunnel, but visible. The newspapers in the North began to whisper of victory. Whispers became headlines, but these headlines were followed by lists, names of the dead, names of the wounded, names of the missing. Every town, every state had given something: a son, a husband, a father. By January's end, more than 600,000 Americans had died in the war. And still it raged on. Public sentiment in the North wavered between grim determination and weary longing. There were peace Democrats, dubbed Copperheads by their opponents, who demanded a swift end to the conflict. They saw Lincoln as a tyrant, his war as a horror, his emancipation policy as reckless social engineering, but they were losing ground. The majority of Northerners now saw the truth. Slavery had caused this war, and slavery must die with it. Otherwise, the bloodshed would be for nothing. Even those who once shrugged off abolition as an idealistic distraction now saw the logic. A fractured peace would only invite another war. The South would rise again. Slavery would spread like a weed. The sacrifices of Gettysburg, Vicksburg, Antietam, all would be rendered meaningless. And so, Lincoln pressed on. His cabinet was divided, as always, but loyal. His Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, pushed for ever more aggressive prosecution of the war. His Secretary of State, William Seward, quietly handled the peace talks, should they ever prove real. In public, Lincoln gave few speeches. He appeared at public receptions, made measured remarks, shook hands. But behind the scenes, he worked tirelessly. He was not the naive rail splitter of earlier years. War had aged him. Death had aged him. His son Willie was gone. His wife Mary was haunted by visions and grief. The White House, once a symbol of political ambition, now felt more like a tomb. Still he wrote. Still he planned. Still he dreamed. In the South, rumors swirled of new armies, of foreign intervention, of secret weapons. But even the truest believers began to doubt. Confederate currency was nearly worthless. Supplies were low. Desertions increased daily. In some places, starving civilians attacked supply trains and storehouses. The romance of secession had become the reality of starvation. And yet, some held on. Robert E. Lee remained dignified, stoic, resolute. His army, though outnumbered, still fought with deadly precision. Southern boys still loaded their rifles and fired into the smoke. Mothers still kissed their sons goodbye. Old men still gave stirring speeches in courthouses. Some still believed, even as the walls closed in. Back in Washington, the Capitol dome gleamed above the half-frozen city. Construction had finally been completed during the war, and the Statue of Freedom atop the dome stared out over a capital that was itself in transition. From a republic of compromise to a nation of conviction. As the cold winds of January howled, a date was set. Peace commissioners from the Confederacy would meet with Union officials at Hampton Roads, Virginia, in early February. Lincoln agreed to attend in person. Not because he expected success, but because he wanted it documented. He wanted the world to see that he had offered peace once again, and that the Confederates had refused anything less than survival. He knew the war was nearing its end, but he also knew something darker. Endings are never clean. They bleed. By the end of January, the 13th Amendment had still not passed in the House of Representatives. It would come to a vote again soon. Lincoln pulled strings, promised favors, appealed to conscience, pressured Democrats, whispered in halls. If the amendment passed, it would become the nail in slavery's coffin. If it failed, the war might end, but the evil would remain. And so, the president waited. Sherman marched. Grant dug in. The South withered, and the nation held its breath. January 1865 passed into history with no parades, no declarations. Just the sound of boots in snow, the thunder of distant guns, the crackle of fire in southern fields, and the silent prayers of mothers on both sides, who just wanted their sons to come home. But war does not end with a prayer, and Lincoln knew it. Victory was coming. But at what cost? And what kind of peace would rise from the ashes? February arrived like a wounded soldier, limping into the final phase of a war that had torn the country in half. The South was on its knees, but it refused to lie down. In Richmond, President Jefferson Davis stared across a landscape of ash and desperation. The Confederate states were unraveling, thread by thread, and even the seams of faith and fire that had once bound them together were splitting apart. Yet Davis would not surrender. He believed, or at least convinced himself, that the South still had a chance, if not for total victory, then for survival. Negotiated peace, perhaps. Foreign sympathy. One decisive battle. Something. But reality didn't share his optimism. The Confederacy had become a nation in name only. It still had flags and speeches, but its cities were starving and its armies melting away. By February 1865, the war had drained the South of almost everything but pride. Richmond trembled with uncertainty. Food was scarce, fuel was gone, Confederate dollars were little more than paper. And then the riots began. Angry, hungry women, many the wives of soldiers, took to the streets. They stormed bakeries and looted shops, shouting for bread, shouting for justice, shouting simply because there was nothing else to do. Davis called for calm, for sacrifice, for dignity. But dignity doesn't feed children. It doesn't warm bones. It doesn't stop the smell of rot from seeping into every crack of a city under siege. The Confederate Congress tried to hold its sessions like normal, but normal was gone. Desperate proposals floated through the smoke-filled chambers. Free the slaves and arm them, some dared suggest, in return for their loyalty. Davis eventually agreed to consider it, a move that would have seemed treasonous just a year earlier. But by now, the Confederacy was short on everything, including white men willing to fight. Robert E. Lee, the once invincible general, was watching his army shrink. His soldiers were malnourished, their uniforms in tatters, their ammunition scarce. Yet they still held the lines around Petersburg. Grant was grinding them down with cold efficiency, hammering away like a blacksmith at an anvil, always pressing, always bleeding them. But Lee was not finished. In those cold days of February, he prepared one final gamble, a breakout, a sudden strike westward to escape Petersburg and join forces with other Confederate remnants. It was daring, desperate, but what else was left? In Washington, Lincoln waited. On March 4th, 1865, under gray skies and a softened rain, Abraham Lincoln stood once more on the steps of the Capitol. His face was lined, his shoulders narrower, his body older than his 56 years. Yet, in that moment, before a crowd of thousands, he spoke not of vengeance, but of unity, not of conquest, but of healing. With malice toward none, he said, voice firm in the drizzle. With charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. It was not a celebration. It was a prayer. There was no gloating in his words, no chest beating, only the heavy burden of a man who had seen too much death, too many torn limbs, too many broken mothers, and wanted only to see the country whole again, not restored to what it was, but lifted into something better. Around him stood soldiers in blue, some fresh-faced, some grizzled, and many, many black. In 1865, the role of black soldiers in the Union Army was no longer a novelty. It was a necessity. Nearly 200,000 had served by then. Freedmen, former slaves, and free black men from the North and South alike. And they were proving themselves with blood. In battlefields across the South, from the swamps of Louisiana to the outskirts of Charleston, black regiments had fought, bled, and died with unflinching resolve. Their courage at Fort Wagner had shattered doubts. Their discipline in battle had silenced critics. Their sacrifice had begun to rewrite the nation's soul. In March, as Sherman cut through the Carolinas and Grant continued to tighten the noose around Lee, these soldiers remained in the thick of it. In places like Honey Hill, they fought back Confederate assaults. In South Carolina, they marched into towns where many of them, or their parents, had once been enslaved. They marched not just as soldiers, but as symbols of what this war now meant. Lincoln knew it. His generals knew it. Even the Confederate commanders knew it. The war had become not just a fight for union, but a fight over the very idea of freedom. Sherman, still relentless, pressed north through South Carolina with brutal efficiency. Columbia, the state capital, was occupied and set ablaze, though debate still rages over who lit the fires. The Confederacy blamed the Yankees. The Yankees blamed retreating Confederates. The truth was likely more chaotic, a city caught between two flames, vengeance and despair. What mattered was the message. Even South Carolina, the firebrand of secession, could not stand against Sherman's march. As the month went on, Lee launched his final gamble at Fort Stedman near Petersburg. A surprise attack meant to break through Union lines and roll back Grant's siege. At first, it worked. The Confederates surged forward, capturing trenches and guns. But then the Union counterattacked. Within hours, the ground was soaked in blood, and Lee's men were driven back. What little strength they had left was wasted. From that point on, Lee knew it was only a matter of time. Yet Davis clung to hope. He still spoke of destiny, of divine favor, of perseverance. He issued proclamations, called for fasting and prayer. He still imagined a last-minute reversal, a miracle on the battlefield, a divided Union peace. But inside the Confederate ranks, reality whispered louder. Desertions increased. Entire units disappeared into the woods. Officers begged for food, for shoes, for reinforcements that would never come. Meanwhile, Union supply lines hummed with efficiency. New rifles, new boots, fresh troops from Pennsylvania and Ohio. The contrast was impossible to ignore. In Washington, Congress finally passed the 13th Amendment at the end of January. But in February and March, the work of ratification began in the states. Lincoln pushed hard behind the scenes. The war might be ending, but it was the amendment, not the battlefield, that would bury slavery once and for all. And he knew the South was watching. If they wanted any say in the peace that followed, they would need to reckon with a new reality. Slavery was over. By mid-March, whispers of surrender crept through Southern camps. But Lee refused, at least not yet. He still held Richmond, still commanded an army, still had his honor, still had the eyes of history on him. And Lincoln waited, patient and grim. The rains of March turned roads into rivers. Disease spread in the camps, but the soldiers, on both sides, kept fighting, not always out of hope. Sometimes just because it was all they knew. In North Carolina, Union forces clashed with remnants of Confederate resistance at places like Bentonville. Another bloody encounter. Another few thousand names carved into the nation's memory. But each battle now felt like a closing act, a final gasp of a dying rebellion. And yet the dying did not stop. Every musket fired in those weeks was a delay of the inevitable. Every cannon blast echoed with futility. The Confederacy had lost the war, but it had not yet laid down its arms. Pride has a long fuse. And so February bled into March, and March bled into April, and the country waited for a surrender that would not come. Not yet. But even Jefferson Davis could no longer deny it. The flames of rebellion still flickered, but the fuel was almost gone, and soon the fire would go out. The end didn't come all at once. It came in cracks. By April 1865, the siege of Petersburg had lasted more than 9 months. 9 months of mud, blood, and slow strangulation. Grant's army had dug in like termites, gnawing away at Confederate defenses one trench at a time. Lee's men held the line, thinner and thinner each week, held together less by supply than by sheer resolve. But resolve couldn't patch holes in their stomachs, or replace the thousands lost to desertion, sickness, and death. Even the strongest will eventually buckle under weight it can no longer bear. On April 1st, 1865, Union forces struck hard at Five Forks, an intersection west of Petersburg that held the key to Lee's last lifeline. Sheridan led the charge. The Confederates tried to hold, but they were too few, too hungry, too late. By nightfall, the road was gone. The flank was turned. The noose was closed. Lee knew it. He wrote to Jefferson Davis that night. His message was blunt. Petersburg would fall. Richmond must be evacuated. The capital of the Confederacy, its pride, its symbol, its heart, could not be saved. Davis received the message on the morning of April 2nd. Church bells were ringing in Richmond. The city was quiet, tense, expectant. But by midday, whispers turned to panic. Government wagons began rolling west. Soldiers appeared in the streets, moving with urgency. Clerks burned papers by the armload. People stood in doorways, watching with wide eyes. It was happening. The government was leaving. Davis boarded a train that afternoon, bound for Danville. His face was grim, set like stone. He left behind not just a city, but a cause. The dream of the Confederacy was still alive in his words, but it was dying in the streets behind him. That night, chaos took its place. The Confederate Army had been ordered to destroy anything that might aid the Union. Armories, warehouses, supply depots. Fires were set. But fire, once unleashed, has no master. Flames leapt from one building to the next, climbing walls, devouring wood and iron and history. Ammunition stores exploded in thunderclaps that shook the city. The sky glowed orange and red, like a final rebellion. The people of Richmond, already numb from war and hunger, now watched their home burn. Looters roamed the streets. Prisons were opened. The air stank of smoke, sweat, and fear. It wasn't just the fall of a city. It was the collapse of a myth. Richmond had been the crown jewel of the Confederacy. Now it was a furnace. And into that furnace, the Union Army marched. At dawn on April 3rd, 1865, blue coats began to enter the smoking ruins. The Confederate soldiers were gone. What remained was ash and silence, broken only by the distant crackle of still-burning buildings. The U.S. flag was raised over the city at 8 a.m. The war was not over, not officially, but something irreversible had happened. The Capitol had fallen. The heart of the rebellion had stopped beating. And then Lincoln came. 2 days later, without ceremony or fanfare, Abraham Lincoln stepped ashore at Rocket's Landing on the banks of the James River. He came not with an army, but with a handful of sailors and officers. No trumpet, no parade. Just the President of the United States, walking through the ruins of rebellion. Word spread quickly. The people of Richmond, black and white, free and formerly enslaved, emerged from hiding to see it for themselves. Some stared in shock, some cheered, some dropped to their knees. Former slaves reached for his hand. Others touched the hem of his coat like a prophet had come. He walked slowly, solemnly, past burned-out houses and shattered windows, past freedmen crying and shouting hallelujahs, past Southern ladies scowling behind curtains. A freed child clung to his leg and asked if he was truly Father Abraham. Lincoln smiled faintly. He said little. He didn't need to. This was not just a visit. It was a reckoning. The same man who had been mocked for years, called a baboon, a tyrant, a backwoods lawyer, was now walking unguarded through the capital of those who had tried to destroy him. And he came not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He toured the former Confederate White House, sat briefly at Jefferson Davis's old desk, then moved on. There was no gloating. He had come to see, to bear witness, to mark the moment. Back in Washington, the news of Richmond's fall spread like wildfire. Bells rang, crowds gathered. There was laughter and tears. For many Northerners, it felt like the end. Cities lit up. Papers ran bold headlines. Richmond taken. Some people expected surrender within days. But Lincoln knew better. Lee's army still lived. Davis still ran. The South still had teeth. Yet it was impossible to deny what had happened. The fall of Richmond was not just strategic. It was symbolic. It was the Confederacy's beating heart torn from its chest, its capital lost, its cities broken, its hopes burning. Even those who still clung to the cause could feel it slipping. Lee's men fled westward, trying to escape Grant's tightening grip. They moved fast, hoping to reach supplies, to regroup, to fight again. But there was no magic left, no miracle strategy, just rations running low, boots worn thin, and Union cavalry always just behind. For Lincoln, Richmond had been more than a city. It was a warning. He had seen the cost of victory with his own eyes. The ruined homes, the starving families, the freed slaves wandering streets, still heavy with soot. He knew that peace, when it came, would not be sweet. It would be fragile, complicated, explosive in new ways. Still, he hoped. The war had taken everything from him but that. He returned to Washington on April 9th. That same day, something happened far to the west of Richmond. Something final. At Appomattox Courthouse, in a modest farmhouse, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. but that's another story. Richmond had already fallen, and with it, the dream of the Confederacy began to rot in the daylight. The final chase began with desperation. After the fall of Richmond and Petersburg, Lee's army slipped westward, bloodied but not broken, trying to outrun the inevitable. His hope, thin as morning mist, was to reach the rail junction at Lynchburg, link up with supplies, maybe even unite with other scattered Confederate forces in North Carolina. Perhaps then he could fight another battle, win a little leverage, and force the Union to the table. But even hope has a breaking point. Every mile westward bled more men from Lee's ranks. Starving, barefoot, many simply collapsed by the roadside. Thousands surrendered without a shot. Wagons sank in the spring mud. Ammunition was low, food nearly gone. Union cavalry under Sheridan blocked their way like wolves circling a wounded stag. And behind them, always behind them, came Grant. Methodical, unrelenting, closing the trap. By April 8th, Lee knew. The roads were cut. The rations promised in Lynchburg were gone. His army, once the pride of the South, had become a husk. He had two choices: die with it or save what was left. At dawn on April 9th, 1865, Lee ordered his last attack. Perhaps, just perhaps, his men could break through one final time. He sent Gordon's corps forward at Appomattox Courthouse, hoping to punch through the blue wall to the west. For a moment, it looked promising. The Federals reeled, fell back. But behind them, fresh Union infantry arrived. The Confederates ran headlong into a second wall, a deeper line, endless blue. Lee pulled back, and then, finally, quietly, he sent word to Grant. The reply came swiftly. Grant would meet him. A white flag went up. At around 1 p.m., the two generals met at the home of Wilmer McLean, a brick farmhouse with white shutters, now suddenly the center of the American universe. McLean, who had fled war once before. Bull Run had started in his front yard, now watched it end in his parlor. Lee arrived first, dressed in full gray uniform, polished boots, a sash and sword. He was dignified, erect, every inch the Southern gentleman. His face bore the weight of 1,000 losses. He carried no bitterness in his eyes, only exhaustion. Grant entered not long after. His uniform was dusty, unadorned, almost wrinkled. He looked like a working man, because he was. He had a splitting headache, hadn't slept well, hadn't eaten much. But when he saw Lee, he seemed to understand what this moment meant. His headache vanished. The two men spoke briefly. Grant recalled their meeting in the Mexican War. Lee responded with polite reserve. They stood in a room with a marble fireplace, a writing table, and a simple settee. No flags, no ceremony, just wood, cloth, and history. Grant got to the point. He asked for terms. And Lee, knowing what he must do, asked for one thing above all: dignity for his men. Grant agreed. He wrote quickly, without delay, the most generous terms a victorious general had ever offered. Confederate officers would be allowed to keep their sidearms and horses. Soldiers would be paroled and sent home, not imprisoned. Those who owned horses could take them to help with spring planting. No punishments, no trials, no humiliation. Lee read the terms carefully. When he saw the part about horses, he looked up. "This will have a great effect upon my men," he said quietly. He signed, and then he stood. He buttoned his coat, bowed slightly, and walked out the door. His orderly brought his horse. Lee mounted slowly, looked toward his men, and rode back, silent, stone-faced, the war behind him. Inside, Grant sat for a moment. A deep quiet fell over the room. He didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He ordered his men not to celebrate, not to fire their guns in victory. "The war's over," he said. The rebels are our countrymen again. It was what Lincoln had wanted. A year earlier, the president had spoken with Grant about the future. Let them up easy, he'd said. Not out of weakness, but wisdom. Lincoln had seen what war had done, how hate multiplies, how revenge poisons. He wanted healing, not triumphalism. Mercy, not retribution. And now, in that little Virginia parlor, Grant had delivered. Outside, Confederate soldiers waited for news. Many already knew. Some wept. Some simply sat down on the grass and stared at their hands. 4 years of war, of comrades lost, of wounds and fire and hunger, and now nothing. Just silence. Union soldiers, too, stood still. There was no shouting. Just a stunned stillness, as if no one quite believed what had just happened. The war that had consumed everything was over, at least here. Yet, not everywhere. Elsewhere, battles still flickered. Confederate units still roamed the South. Jefferson Davis still ran. But Appomattox had broken the spell. Lee was more than a general. He was a symbol. And with his surrender, the backbone of the Confederacy had snapped. Lincoln received the news 2 days later. He had been waiting, pacing. When it came, he breathed deep and said only, "Thank God." But peace would not come as quickly as war had. Across the country, reactions were mixed. In the North, there was celebration, yes, but also confusion. What now? What to do with the South? With the freed slaves? With the traitors? In the South, grief hardened into silence. Some accepted the loss. Others whispered of future rebellion. The dream was dead, but the pride still lived. And in the shadows of that pride, new tensions were already stirring. Grant returned to his men. Lee returned to his silence. And McLean, whose house had hosted the end of the war, sat in his parlor as soldiers carried off his tables and chairs as souvenirs. The furniture would be scattered across the country, pieces of memory, fragments of an ending. Appomattox was not a moment of victory. It was a moment of mercy. And mercy, like war, leaves its own scars. By April 10th, the surrender was official. By April 12th, the Confederate troops marched in to stack their arms. Gordon's men, worn thin, gray, and ragged, marched past Union lines. As they passed, the Union soldiers, at first ordered to stand silently, couldn't help themselves. Some saluted, some removed their caps, not in celebration, but in recognition, not of rebellion, but of shared suffering. Joshua Chamberlain, the Union officer in charge, ordered his men to carry arms in salute. Gordon, surprised, returned the gesture. It was a quiet, human moment in the midst of all the blood and ashes. The Civil War had ended with dignity, on the battlefield at least. But the war for America's soul was just beginning. The guns had fallen silent at Appomattox. But peace, real peace, would prove harder than war. The sky over Washington on April 14th, 1865, was clear and calm. Spring had arrived, and with it, the feeling of something long awaited, relief. The war was over, at least in spirit. Lee had surrendered. Richmond had fallen. The guns, at last, had gone quiet. And Abraham Lincoln, worn thin from 4 years of war, had begun to breathe again. That morning, he rose early. He met with his cabinet, laughed with his son Tad, and took a carriage ride with his wife Mary. She noted how light he seemed, how different. For the first time in years, she said, he looked happy. He told her about the dreams he'd had, strange, flickering dreams of water and silence, of a ship moving fast through the darkness. But he dismissed it with a smile. That evening, they would go to the theater. Ford's Theater on 10th Street was staging a comedy, Our American Cousin. Lincoln enjoyed the theater, its rhythm, its distraction, its honest laughter. It offered escape, and after 4 years of death and decisions, he welcomed the sound of people laughing again. He invited General Grant to join them, but the general declined. Others were considered. In the end, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris, joined the Lincolns for the show. The president arrived late, as he often did, and the performance paused briefly as he entered the box above stage right. The audience stood and applauded. He bowed gently. The actors resumed, and the president settled into his chair, tall, lean, silent. Elsewhere in the theater, a man moved with practiced ease through the corridors. He wasn't a stranger here. He knew the building, the people, the backways and stairwells. He had performed here many times. His name was John Wilkes Booth, actor, Southerner, Confederate sympathizer, and now assassin. He had planned it for weeks, though the original plan was grander: to kidnap the president, to hold him hostage, to ransom him for the South. But Appomattox had crushed that dream. Lee was done. The war was dying. The South had lost. And Booth, furious, desperate, and self-deluded, decided that if the Confederacy could not live, then Lincoln must die. He believed himself a patriot, a hero, a Brutus to Lincoln's Caesar. But he was not driven by principle. He was driven by bitterness, vanity, and the need to matter. He wanted to stop Reconstruction before it began. He wanted the North to feel pain, loss, chaos. He wanted revenge. He chose that night. Good Friday. The theater was familiar, and the president's presence had been announced. Booth knew the play, knew the lines, knew the exact moment when the laughter would be loudest, when no one would hear the sound of a gun. He crossed the alley behind the theater and entered through the back. No one stopped him. He moved upstairs to the dress circle, showed a calling card to a guard outside the presidential box, and slipped inside. He wedged the doors shut behind him with a piece of wood, quietly, without a sound. Inside the box, Lincoln sat at the front, watching the stage. Mary beside him, Clara and Major Rathbone just behind. The president laughed, relaxed. The moment had come. Booth stepped forward and raised a small Derringer pistol, a single-shot weapon, close range, deadly. He aimed it behind Lincoln's left ear and pulled the trigger. The crack of the gun was muffled by the laughter on stage. Some heard it and thought it part of the show. Others turned too late. Lincoln slumped forward, instantly unconscious. Mary screamed. Rathbone jumped up, grappling with Booth, who drew a long dagger and slashed him savagely across the arm and chest. Blood sprayed. Booth ran to the front of the box and leapt. But the flag draped over the railing caught his spur. He stumbled mid-air and landed badly on the stage below, snapping a bone in his left leg. He staggered to his feet, raised the knife, and shouted something. Some say it was Sic Semper Tyrannis, thus always to tyrants. Others remember him crying, "The South is avenged." Then he ran. The theater erupted into panic. Screams, gasps, chaos. On stage, the actors froze in shock. In the box, Clara tried to stop Mary from collapsing. Rathbone, bleeding badly, shouted for help. People surged forward, unsure of what had just happened, until the word spread like wildfire. The president had been shot. A doctor, Charles Leal, was among the audience. He rushed to the box and examined Lincoln, who was still breathing, shallow and slow. The wound was grave. The bullet had entered behind his left ear, traveled through his brain, and lodged behind his right eye. There was nothing to be done. They carried him across the street to a nearby boarding house, the Peterson House. He was too tall for the bed, so they laid him diagonally. Mary followed, weeping uncontrollably, clinging to his limp hand. The night passed in silence, broken only by sups and whispers. Cabinet members arrived, generals, friends. They stood in silence, watching the president die inch by inch, breath by breath. Outside, crowds gathered, the streets filled with citizens, stunned, waiting for news. Word of the shooting spread by telegraph, reaching New York, Philadelphia, Boston. Bells tolled. People wept openly. The joy of victory evaporated like morning dew. John Wilkes Booth had vanished into the night. He limped southward, aided by a network of sympathizers, carrying the broken leg and the illusion of glory. He believed the South would cheer his name. But even in Dixie, the murder of Lincoln stirred horror. What Booth had done was not a blow for liberty. It was an act of madness. Back in Washington, the candle burned low. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, Abraham Lincoln took his final breath. His face, they said, looked peaceful. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing by his side, whispered the words that would be etched into history. Now he belongs to the ages. Mary Todd Lincoln collapsed into grief. Tad, the president's youngest son, wailed when told his father was gone. The nation stood still. Flags were lowered to half-mast. Black bunting hung from every door. Church bells rang out a dirge. Crowds gathered in silence in front of newspaper offices. Nothing else mattered. The man who had saved the Union was dead. Not on the battlefield, not in sickness, but by a bullet in a theater on a spring night. That same day, Vice President Andrew Johnson was sworn in as president. There was no ceremony, no joy, just a silent oath, taken in the shadow of death. Johnson would inherit the task of stitching the country back together. But it would never be the same. Lincoln had been the compass. Now, the nation was adrift. Booth would be found 12 days later in a tobacco barn in Virginia. Surrounded, wounded, and unrepentant, he was shot and killed. His last words were whispered through blood. Useless, useless. But the damage had been done. Lincoln's death tore open wounds that had barely begun to close. It turned him into a martyr, a saint, a legend. It added fire to Reconstruction, deepened divisions, hardened hearts. And in Ford's Theater, the blood-stained flag remained, tattered and silent, a relic of that terrible moment. The stage where laughter turned to horror, where freedom won and grief followed. April 14th, 1865. The night the lights went out in Washington, the night the war's final shot hit its truest mark, the night the president went to the theater and never came home. The shot that rang out at Ford's Theater on April 14th, 1865, did not just silence a president. It cracked the entire country open. As Abraham Lincoln lay dying in the boarding house across the street, a second story began to unfold. A story of smoke and shadows, of betrayal and pursuit. The man who had pulled the trigger, John Wilkes Booth, did not vanish like a ghost. He ran, on foot and horseback, through mud and forest, chased by the fury of a grieving nation. The largest manhunt in American history had begun. Booth limped out of Washington with a shattered leg and a head full of fire. He had broken it leaping from the presidential box to the stage, a grand flourish meant to symbolize his triumph. Instead, it became the first sign of his failure. He had expected to be hailed as a Southern hero. He expected cheers, a tide of support, maybe even another war. What he found was silence, confusion, and fear. He met up with a co-conspirator, David Harold, and together they fled south into Maryland. It was all arranged, or so Booth thought. He had prepared escape routes, sympathizers, caches. But as the news of the assassination spread, the air changed. What had once been a network of quiet Confederate support suddenly grew cold. Lincoln was dead, but Booth had not struck a blow for liberty. He had murdered a man whose face was now being mourned across the country, even in places that once called him tyrant. Back in Washington, chaos exploded. Soldiers locked down the Capitol. Bridges were secured. Telegraph lines burned with orders. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton took control like a man possessed. He declared martial law. He ordered arrests. He deployed cavalry. And he made it clear John Wilkes Booth would not escape. By the morning of April 15th, Booth and Harold had reached the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Mudd examined Booth's leg, confirmed the break, and set it in a crude splint. He claimed he didn't know Booth had just assassinated the president. He would later be arrested for aiding a fugitive. Whether out of loyalty or fear, he had let them go. Booth moved on, hobbling through swamps and pine forest, riding hard despite the pain. He had grown up in the theater, surrounded by illusion and applause. But now the audience had turned. His name was on every poster, every bulletin. Wanted for murder. A $100,000 reward hung over his head. And the manhunt stretched across every county, every state, every back road in Virginia. 12 days. That's how long he ran. Along the way, Booth left behind a strange trail of letters and justifications. He believed himself a hero, a savior of the South. In his mind, Lincoln had been a tyrant, and he had delivered justice. He couldn't see the truth, how quickly the world was leaving him behind. Even former Confederates recoiled. They had lost the war. But this wasn't honor. This wasn't strategy. It was an act of cowardice wrapped in theater. Union detectives closed in, following rumors and broken whispers. Every farmhouse was questioned. Every river crossing watched. As Booth and Harold crept deeper into Virginia, they sought shelter with Confederate sympathizers still clinging to their lost cause. But even among those faithful, there was unease. Helping them meant risking everything. Booth's limp was worse. His spirits dipped and rose like a fever, sometimes defiant, sometimes despairing. By April 24th, the trail ended at a tobacco farm owned by Richard Garrett near Port Royal, Virginia. Booth and Harold convinced the family to let them stay in the barn. Garrett suspected they were deserters from the Confederate Army. He gave them food, blankets, and a place to sleep. But the next day, rumors reached him of soldiers approaching. He locked the barn, hoping to keep the strangers safe or contained. The cavalry arrived the next night. 26 Union soldiers, under the command of Lieutenant Edward Doherty, surrounded the property in silence. They had tracked Booth through whispers, hints, and instinct. They knew he was here. The barn was dark. Inside, Booth and Harold crouched among the hay and tools, listening to footsteps draw near. Stanton had given orders, take Booth alive, if possible. Harold surrendered first. He stumbled out, hands up, terrified, begging for mercy. But Booth stayed inside. He shouted defiance. He refused to come out. He said he'd never be taken alive. The soldiers threatened to burn the barn. Booth taunted them. He had one pistol left and a knife. That was all. The flames were lit. The dry tobacco and timber caught quickly. Fire licked up the walls, casting the barn in an orange glow. Inside, Booth was illuminated at last. His face gaunt, filthy, wild-eyed. A soldier saw him raise his pistol and took the shot. Sergeant Boston Corbett fired through a crack in the wall. The bullet struck Booth in the neck, shattering vertebrae, severing the spinal cord. They dragged him out of the burning barn. He was still alive, barely. He couldn't speak at first. He gasped for air, paralyzed, blinking furiously. The soldiers laid him on the porch of the farmhouse as the barn burned behind them. In the flickering light, Booth tried to speak. His last words were a whisper. "Tell my mother I died for my country," he said. Then, after a moment of silence, he added two final words, barely audible. "Useless, useless." He died hours later. It was over. 12 days, 2 states, dozens of miles. And now the man who had murdered the president lay dead, his face scorched, his life extinguished. But the questions had only begun. Back in Washington, the arrest wave continued. Booth had not acted alone. Investigators rounded up his co-conspirators: Lewis Powell, who had tried to murder Secretary of State Seward; George Atzerodt, who was supposed to kill Vice President Johnson but lost his nerve; and Mary Surratt, who had housed the plotters in her boarding house. A military tribunal was formed. In a summer of sweltering trials, 8 conspirators were convicted. 4 were hanged. Among them was Mary Surratt, the first woman executed by the U.S. government. The executions shocked the public. Some called it justice. Others called it vengeance. And still the rumors grew. Was Booth truly dead? Had someone helped him escape? Was the assassination part of a larger Confederate plot? Did Jefferson Davis know? Did foreign agents help? For years, theories spiraled. Some claimed Booth fled to South America. Others whispered of body doubles and secret messages. None were proven. But conspiracies cling to national tragedy like fog on a battlefield. The manhunt had ended, but the wound it uncovered would take generations to close. Lincoln was gone, but his shadow grew larger. Booth had tried to destroy a president. Instead, he had elevated him into legend. Lincoln the man had died. Lincoln the martyr was born. His name etched in stone, his face carved in monuments, his words quoted as scripture. And John Wilkes Booth, once an actor, once a name known in theaters from Boston to New Orleans, became a footnote, a symbol of what hate looks like when it loses everything. The barn in Port Royal collapsed into ash. The bullet that killed the assassin was displayed in museums, and the nation, still stunned by grief, staggered toward a future it barely understood. 12 days. That's all it took for a man to run out of time. But his echo would last much longer. The shot had been fired. The assassin was dead. The war, in its final convulsions, was over. But the heart of the nation had stopped beating. Abraham Lincoln was gone, and America had to learn how to breathe again. It began with silence. In Washington, the noise of politics and war faded. Streets emptied. Flags drooped at half-mast, edged in black. Windows were draped in mourning cloth. Soldiers stood guard at the Peterson house where Lincoln had died, as thousands filed past in stunned procession. Some wept openly. Others bowed their heads and shuffled along in solemn reverence. Mary Todd Lincoln, shattered by grief, withdrew from the world, unable to bear the funeral, the ceremonies, the sound of his name. But the country needed to grieve. The man who had carried the Union through its darkest storm was now its fallen captain. And so, a decision was made. Lincoln would go home, not quietly, but slowly, with the whole nation watching. His body would be taken by train from Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois. The route would mirror the one he had taken 4 years earlier, when he had traveled east to assume the presidency. Then, he had been full of hope. Now, he was encased in a coffin of rosewood and lead. The train left Washington on April 21st, 1865. It was no ordinary journey. It moved through 7 states, stopping in 13 major cities. Over 1,600 miles of track lay ahead, and the weight it carried was heavier than any engine had borne before. This was no simple transport. It was a pilgrimage. At every station, thousands waited. Black and white, rich and poor, Union veterans and mothers in mourning bonnets. Some had traveled for days to glimpse the train. Others stood silently in farm fields as it passed, hats in hand. At night, the locomotives were draped in black and illuminated by lanterns. Plumes of smoke drifted through the dark like ghosts. The train was dubbed the Lincoln Special, and it moved like a funeral dirge carved in steel. First stop, Baltimore. A city once rife with secessionist tension now knelt in mourning. Then on to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where thousands stood in silence as the casket was taken to the state capitol. In Philadelphia, the crowds were so dense that police and soldiers could barely keep order. Lincoln's body lay in state at Independence Hall, where the Declaration of Independence had been signed. There, as thousands shuffled past in hushed reverence, the symbolism struck deep. The man who had saved the Union now rested in the building where it had been born. Some waited for 24 hours just to file past the casket for a single, silent moment. Many brought their children. Others collapsed from exhaustion or grief. One man fell to his knees and prayed aloud. A black Union soldier, weeping, saluted and said, "He died for me." And still the train moved. In New York City, the procession was enormous. Nearly 500,000 people lined the streets. Businesses closed, bells tolled. Lincoln's body was carried through the city on a black-draped hearse drawn by 16 white horses, each adorned with mourning plumes. Onlookers stood in absolute silence, broken only by the slow beat of drums and the cry of distant trumpets. Some said it was as if time itself had stopped. But the journey was not just about grief. It was about transformation. With each mile, Lincoln was becoming something more than a president. He was becoming a myth, a martyr, a symbol of unity, of sacrifice, of what America had been and what it might become. In life, he had been mocked, criticized, doubted. In death, he became immortal. The train rolled on through Albany, Buffalo, Cleveland, Columbus. In each city, the crowds returned, grief given voice through hymns, poems, sermons, and song. Choirs sang "Nearer, My God, to Thee." Bands played solemn dirges. Ministers spoke of Moses and deliverance, of Golgotha and sacrifice. Everywhere the casket was open for viewing. Lincoln's body, embalmed and dressed in black, lay beneath glass. His face had changed, the lines had softened, the pain gone. Some said he looked like he was sleeping. Others said he looked like he had already joined the angels. But not all who mourned knew him as a distant figure. In Springfield, where he had lived for decades, he had been a neighbor, a friend, a lawyer, a man. As the train drew closer to Illinois, the grief turned more personal. School children lined the tracks with flags. Farmers stood beside their plows. Women pressed their hands to their mouths, stunned by the sight of the train. And inside the cars, the atmosphere was heavy. The honor guard, those who traveled with the body, rarely spoke. They watched out windows streaked with soot and shadow. Some prayed. Some simply sat, lost in thought. The scent of embalming fluid mixed with candle wax. The weight of the casket reminded everyone that this was real. The war was over, but it had taken its final, most painful casualty. On May 3rd, 1865, the Lincoln funeral train reached its final destination, Springfield, Illinois. The city was transformed. Homes were draped in black. Streets were lined with mourning banners. The hearse that carried the president through town was topped with a massive eagle and covered in floral wreaths. As the casket made its final journey through the streets of Springfield, the silence was so deep it pressed against the skin. On May 4th, beneath a gray sky and a slight breeze, Abraham Lincoln was laid to rest in Oak Ridge Cemetery. He was buried beside his young son Willie, whose death in 1862 had broken the president's heart. A temporary tomb was constructed and the casket lowered. Mary Todd Lincoln was not present. Her grief had overwhelmed her. A nation stood still. The war was over. The president was gone. The flag still flew. But everything had changed. What remained was the echo. In towns and cities across the country, memorial services were held. Newspapers printed poems, sermons, woodcuts of Lincoln ascending to heaven. Artists painted him in white robes. Children recited his speeches. A generation grew up not knowing Lincoln the man, only Lincoln the legend. He became a second Washington, towering, solemn, remote. But unlike Washington, he was not carved in marble from the start. He had risen from nothing, built himself through labor, loss, and language. And in the end, he had paid the price for his convictions. The North saw him as a savior. Many in the South, in time, came to see him as a tragedy. Black Americans saw him as a liberator. And in that fragile moment between war and peace, a country looked into its own broken heart and wondered whether it could ever be whole again. The train was gone. The casket buried. But the story of Abraham Lincoln was just beginning. He stood awkwardly, one hand on a Bible, his other trembling slightly. Andrew Johnson, the 17th President of the United States, had taken the oath of office in the shadow of death. It was April 15th, 1865, just hours after Abraham Lincoln had died. The room was small, the mood funereal, the silence broken only by the words of the oath. There was no ceremony, no celebration. There was only grief and the heavy burden of stepping into a dead man's shoes. Johnson had been a peculiar choice for vice president, a Southern Democrat from Tennessee, added to the Republican ticket in 1864 as a gesture of unity. A Unionist who had refused to secede with his state. A former slaveholder who spoke the language of the working poor but carried deep prejudices of his own. When Lincoln chose him, it was political calculation. When Lincoln died, it became something far more dangerous. Now the war was ending, and peace had no shepherd. Reconstruction, barely more than a theory during Lincoln's lifetime, was now Johnson's to shape. The South was in ruins. Cities like Richmond, Atlanta, and Charleston were burned-out skeletons. Railroad tracks twisted. Plantations gutted. Millions of formerly enslaved people were suddenly free, but not safe and not secure. What freedom would mean? Land, rights, protection? Was a question that demanded an answer. Johnson had answers, but not the ones many hoped for. In his first days as president, Johnson presented himself as a man of strength, a man of law, a man who would restore the Union on his terms. He despised the Confederate elite, the planters and politicians who had dragged the South into war. He spoke with scorn about traitors, called for hangings, thundered against rebellion. But beneath that rage lay another conviction. The white South should govern itself again, quickly, quietly, without interference. He believed in union, not in transformation. He had once owned slaves, though he now claimed to support emancipation. He loathed secessionists, but distrusted Black Americans even more. He saw them not as citizens, but as a problem to be managed. His speeches were filled with contradictions, grand promises of order, followed by angry tirades. He was not Lincoln. He did not pretend to be. In the summer of 1865, Johnson moved fast. He began issuing pardons to former Confederates by the thousands. Wealthy Southerners had to petition him directly, and they did, in a parade of letters, visits, and groveling. He granted most. By fall, ex-Confederate generals, politicians, and planters were walking free, some regaining their old lands, others returning to local office. Meanwhile, the Southern states were allowed to reconstitute their governments. No trials, no sweeping reforms, no guarantees of rights for freedmen. Johnson had placed only minimal requirements: renounce secession, abolish slavery on paper, and pledge loyalty to the Union. The results were predictable. Across the South, the old elite returned to power under new banners. State legislatures began passing laws, so-called black codes, that restricted the rights of newly freed slaves. These laws varied by state but carried a common message: freedom, yes, but not equality. Freedmen could not vote, could not testify against whites, could be arrested for vagrancy and apprenticed back to their former masters. They were free in name, but shackled by law. Northern observers were horrified. Union soldiers, still stationed across the South, watched with growing unease. Abolitionists and radical Republicans in Congress, who had long feared this outcome, began to prepare for a confrontation. Johnson, however, saw no problem. He blamed the unrest on agitators and radicals. He vetoed bills that would have extended the Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency created to help former slaves with food, education, and legal aid. He argued that federal intervention was tyranny, that states should govern themselves, that the South had suffered enough. But Congress was no longer willing to follow the president's lead. By late 1865, tensions between Johnson and Congress had reached a boil. Men like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, powerful Republicans in the House and Senate, believed Reconstruction must do more than simply stitch the country back together. It had to reimagine it. A new nation, not just in form, but in substance. A nation where all men were equal under the law, where Black Americans could vote, serve, own land, build wealth. Johnson rejected that vision entirely. He went on tour in 1866, campaigning against what he called the radical Republicans, accusing them of trying to destroy the Constitution. His speeches grew unhinged, ranting, even drunk at times. In Cleveland, he was heckled by a crowd and lashed back with insults. At East, newspapers reported his words with disbelief. The image of the president, barely a year after Lincoln's death, screaming at ordinary citizens from a balcony. It was not the healing leadership the country had hoped for. The divide widened. Johnson tried to stop Congress from passing the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which granted citizenship and equal protection to all people born in the United States, regardless of race. He vetoed it. Congress overrode him, the first major override in U.S. history. It was a turning point. The battle over Reconstruction was now fully underway, and Johnson was losing ground. Freedmen in the South, meanwhile, were trying to build lives from the rubble. Some founded schools, churches, towns. They gathered in mass meetings, voted in local union leagues, held fast to their freedom with strength and dignity. But they faced violence. From ex-Confederate mobs, from local sheriffs, and increasingly from the rise of secret groups. Men in hoods, riding at night, terrorizing black communities to restore white supremacy by fear. The Ku Klux Klan had been born in Tennessee that same year, and Johnson said nothing. As 1865 turned to 1866, and then to 1867, the clash between President and Congress intensified. Radical Republicans pushed for more aggressive Reconstruction policies, including military districts in the South, federal enforcement of civil rights, and eventually the 14th Amendment, enshrining equal protection into the Constitution itself. Johnson opposed it all. He wanted restoration. Congress wanted revolution. The future of the nation teetered between those two visions. What had begun as mourning was turning into something else. Lincoln had died before he could see Reconstruction unfold. In his absence, the task had passed to a man who could not rise to meet it. And the result was chaos, half measures, betrayal. Andrew Johnson had taken the reins, but the horse was dragging him toward a cliff. He had the title, but not the trust. He had the power, but not the purpose, and the promise of a better union. One redeemed by blood and sacrifice was already slipping through his fingers. The war was officially over. The Confederacy shattered, its generals defeated, its president on the run. But the echoes of slavery did not stop just because the guns had fallen silent. In Texas, the fields were still worked by black men and women who didn't yet know they were free. News traveled slowly, and sometimes not at all, especially when those who held power had no reason to share it. On June 19, 1865, 2 months after Appomattox, a Union ship docked in the harbor at Galveston. The war had never truly touched this far-flung corner of the South in full force. Battles had been few, federal control weak. And so the old system had lingered. Cotton was still picked, orders still barked, whips still cracked. But that morning, everything changed. Major General Gordon Granger stepped ashore with a contingent of Union soldiers and issued General Order No. 3. The message was read aloud, posted on walls, spoken in town squares. It was simple, clear, and irreversible. The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. Freedom had arrived. Late, but undeniable. For the more than 250,000 enslaved people still living in Texas, the words came like a thunderclap. Some wept, some fell to their knees, others ran, walked, stood stunned in disbelief. What had been rumor became fact. What had been feared became hope. And what had been stolen was finally returned. The day would come to be known as Juneteenth. In that moment, there were no fireworks, no parades, no national holiday. Just a fractured, fragile sense of something new. Freedom wasn't clean. It didn't come with compensation or apology. It didn't arrive with protection or a plan. But it was real. And that, for the people who had endured generations of bondage, was everything. Some stayed where they were, unsure of where to go or who to trust. Others packed what little they had and set off down the roads. North, west, anywhere but here. Churches sprang up overnight. Marriages were made official. Children were given new names. Entire lives were rebuilt from ashes. But not everyone welcomed the news. Plantation owners in Texas, many of whom had fled there from other Confederate states to escape advancing Union troops, resisted the order. Some delayed informing their slaves for days or weeks. Others tried to renegotiate labor by force or fraud. White supremacist violence, already common across the South, would soon follow. But Juneteenth was a turning point. It was the last gasp of slavery and the first breath of something different. It was a day not just of liberation, but of reckoning. A final chapter written in longhand across a country still unsure of its future. And even as freedom was proclaimed, war still flickered. In Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma, a Confederate flag still flew. There, a Cherokee man named Stand Watie had fought a war within a war. A brigadier general in the Confederate Army, Watie had led native troops in brutal raids across the frontier. He was a veteran fighter, a survivor of the Trail of Tears, and a man torn between allegiances. Many native nations had allied with the Confederacy, hoping to preserve their own sovereignty in a country that had already broken every promise made to them. By June, most had surrendered. Watie had not. He held out, still commanding a small force, still believing that resistance might matter, still clinging to a cause that had long since died elsewhere. It wasn't until June 23rd, 1865, 4 days after Juneteenth, that Watie finally laid down his arms. He was the last Confederate general to surrender. It was not a grand event. No parade, no handshake in a parlor, just a formal agreement signed near Dokesville. A quiet end in a quiet place. And with that, the Confederate States of America ceased to exist in every meaningful way. But its ghost would linger. The death of slavery didn't mean the birth of equality. In fact, the very next phase, the age of Reconstruction, would reveal just how deep the poison ran. Laws would be rewritten to restrict black freedom. White mobs would enforce racial order through terror. New systems, sharecropping, convict leasing, segregated education, would rise in the place of old chains. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, abolished slavery, except as a punishment for crime. That exception would be exploited for generations. In the same month that slavery was formally ended, Southern legislatures passed black codes to limit the movement, labor, and rights of freedmen. Freed people could now be jailed for vagrancy, fined, and leased out to white employers. The plantations were gone, but the power structure remained. Violence became the language of resistance. White vigilante groups, many formed by former Confederate soldiers, carried out lynchings, arsons, and threats designed to keep black Americans in their place. The Ku Klux Klan, formed in Tennessee in late 1865, began to spread like wildfire. Hoods and crosses replaced uniforms. The war had ended, but the battle for freedom had only shifted shape. In Texas, some of the very soldiers who had brought word of emancipation were now tasked with defending it. Freedmen's Bureau agents attempted to mediate labor contracts, provide education, and punish abuses. But they were too few, and the hostility around them too deep. For every school built, a teacher was threatened. For every courthouse victory, there was a backlash. And yet, the freedmen endured. They built churches, communities, mutual aid societies. They registered to vote when allowed. They sought education, land, stability. Juneteenth began to take root as a day of remembrance and celebration. Barbecues, prayers, parades, and storytelling became its heartbeat. It started in Texas, but in time it spread across the South, then the country. Each Juneteenth was a quiet act of defiance against a nation that had not yet honored its promises. A reminder that freedom is not given. It is declared and then defended. Back in Washington, the political storms intensified. President Johnson, unwilling to challenge white Southern power, vetoed civil rights legislation and obstructed federal efforts to protect Black Americans. Congress pushed back hard. The seeds of a constitutional showdown were being sown. But in the countryside, in the fields and churches and cabins of the formerly enslaved, a different story was being written. They had survived, and now, slowly, painfully, they were trying to live. Juneteenth wasn't just a delayed freedom, it was a symbol of how long it takes for truth to arrive, how stubborn injustice can be, how easily liberty can be declared on paper, and how hard it is to see it take root in reality. The war was over. The Confederacy had surrendered. The guns had stopped. But racism, resentment, and resistance remained. Freedom had come. Late, uneven, fragile. But it had come. And the people who received it on June 19, 1865, held it close like something sacred, because they knew, even then, that the hardest part was just beginning. The smoke had cleared. The bodies were buried. The war was over. But peace did not arrive with fanfare. It came like a hesitant stranger, stepping into a house still filled with the echoes of screams. 1865 had begun with fire and ended in silence. But inside that silence, something new was forming. Something fragile, unfinished, and entirely without precedent. The United States, once torn in two, was one country again. And yet, it was not the same country it had been before. The lines on the map were familiar, but everything else had changed. At the heart of that change was a coffin. Lincoln's death hung like a veil over the year's end. It wasn't just that he had been murdered. It was when. 5 days after Lee surrendered, when the cheering had just begun, when people were starting to believe they could breathe again, when the war had ended, but before the peace had started. He died in the quiet in between, and in doing so, left behind a question that no one could yet answer. What would the country be without him? He had guided the Union through its most violent trial, made impossible choices, suffered humiliations, faced ridicule, and still stood tall enough to deliver a vision of mercy at the end. He had wanted to bind the nation's wounds, not reopen them. But now his hands were gone, and the scalpel had been passed to a man who held it like a club. Andrew Johnson had no Lincolnian poetry in him. He had no patience for compromise, no capacity for moral grandeur. His reconstruction was a patchwork of pardons and missed opportunities, a return to order over justice. He restored governments before he protected rights. He forgave traitors before he freed victims. And in doing so, he set the stage for a new conflict, not of muskets, but of laws and terror, of policy and blood. As Southern states rejoined the Union, they brought back with them the old instincts. White supremacy did not vanish with the Confederate flag. It adapted, it regrouped. It found new uniforms, new language, new legal tools. The black codes replaced slave codes. Sharecropping replaced the plantation. Night riders replaced the overseer. Congress, watching from the north, began to realize that something had gone wrong. The war had ended, but the cause for which it was fought, whether this nation would truly be a land of freedom, was still undecided. So they pushed back. 1865 saw the early cracks in what would become a full-blown confrontation between the legislative and executive branches. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was drafted. The 14th Amendment began to take shape. Radical Republicans, frustrated with Johnson's obstruction, began plotting a new path, one that would bypass the president altogether, one that would bring the power of federal law into the South and, for the first time, protect black lives with the full force of the Constitution. But even among the victors, unity was not guaranteed. The North was exhausted. Hundreds of thousands of sons and fathers would never return home. Empty chairs sat at dinner tables. Crutches lined the steps of churches. Graveyards swelled. And in that grief, many longed not for justice, but for rest. At the same time, veterans returned home with a new sense of what the nation was and what it could be. Many had fought not just to preserve the Union, but to transform it. They had marched beside black soldiers, seen their courage, heard their stories. For them, Reconstruction was not a burden. It was a continuation of the war's moral victory. Still, the road ahead was unclear. Economically, the country had been gutted. Southern infrastructure lay in ruins. Northern industries had boomed during the war, but now faced recession. The railroads creaked under the strain of westward expansion. The national debt had soared. Greenbacks flooded the economy, and debates about gold and silver began to stir. A new age of capitalism was dawning, one with rail tycoons, industrial barons, and rising cities. Politically, too, the ground was shifting. The Republican Party, once a coalition of abolitionists and pragmatists, began to fracture. Some wanted to punish the South. Others wanted to rebuild it. Still others feared that black citizenship would shift the balance of power in ways they could not control. The Democratic Party, stained by association with secession and Copperheads, struggled to find its voice again. But underneath it all, something was being born. Not a finished nation, not yet, but a new one. The year 1865 did not deliver America into peace. It delivered her into rebirth. The 13th Amendment, passed in Congress in January and ratified by the end of the year, abolished slavery once and for all. It was a constitutional exorcism, surgical, hard-won, and long overdue. With one stroke of the pen, 4 million people were no longer property. But they were not yet citizens, and they were not yet safe. Still, it was a start. Schools for freedmen began to spring up, often built by Northern teachers and newly literate black communities. Churches became pillars of strength. The Freedmen's Bureau, underfunded, overworked, did what it could. Former slaves searched for lost family members, placed ads in newspapers, walked hundreds of miles hoping to reunite with mothers, sisters, children. Some succeeded, others never did. In the cultural silence after Lincoln's assassination, newspapers tried to capture what he had meant. Poets wrote elegies, artists painted him as a saint, monuments began to rise. His words, once mocked as awkward or naive, were reprinted and memorized. The Gettysburg Address, barely noticed at the time it was spoken, now found new life. His second inaugural was read from pulpits like scripture. Malice toward none, charity for all. But malice was very much alive. So was hate, so was fear, and still, hope endured. In 1865, the country had reached the edge of a cliff. It could turn back, or it could leap. Reconstruction would become the fight to decide which it would be. The seeds of modern America, racial justice, federal power, civil rights, the limits of freedom, were planted in that year. Planted in the blood of battlefields and the silence of mourning parlors, in the dust of cotton fields and the marble of Washington halls. Nothing would be the same again, not the South, stripped of its slaves and its pride, not the North, burdened by victory and guilt, not the West, beckoning expansion with the cost of native lives, not the Constitution, now rewritten in the ink of emancipation. The old America died in 1865. The new one hadn't been born yet, but the labor had begun.